Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Winter Ag Workshop series. Today, we are joined by Jody and Andy from Penn State Extension, and they'll be discussing rain gardens. So, a couple quick things first. The pretest is in the chat box. If you've not done that already, please go ahead and do that. The chat box is the way for you to communicate with us. If you want everyone to see your messages, make sure the drop down says everyone. Otherwise, it's just us behind the scenes. Go ahead, drop any questions that you have throughout the session in that or in the Q&A box, and we will have a time for questions at the end. And otherwise, we will send out some resources tomorrow as well as the post-test. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Andy.
Thank you, Cassidy, and thank you to the Friends of the Ag Foundation for having us here. My name's Andy. I'm one of two speakers you'll see today. My last name is Yenshaw. I'm a water resources educator with Penn State Extension. I'm joining you from my home office in Cumberland County, but I do water resources programming across the state. Jody and I have a whole bunch of material for you, so I'm just going to jump into it real quick here, and we'll leave time at the end for some questions. We'll try to get through all this in about 50 minutes or so, so there's at least 10 minutes for questions. So let's see, can I advance slides? There we go. So we're part of Penn State Extension. I won't provide much detail here other than we're an extension of the university if you haven't heard about us. And we're the people who brought you the Master Gardeners and 4-H, and we also work in many other areas, including water quality. So let's get right to rain gardens. This is a talk that Jody largely put together for kind of our rain garden focus. We talked to all kinds of groups and communities about rain gardens, but we've adapted it here to kind of focus on issues you may face as a school. So this is Jody and I. Jody's in York County. I'll let her introduce herself more when her time is up. This is what we're going to talk about today. What's stormwater? We'll talk about how rain gardens are one best management practice of many. We'll define rain gardens. We'll look at planning and construction. We'll spend quite a bit of time on plants and maintenance. We'll talk about how this can align with programming you may already be doing in your school. We'll look at some resources and share contact information. So it really all starts with stormwater. Rain gardens are a stormwater best management practice, and stormwater is just the precipitation, the rainwater, and the snow melt and the ice melt today. Today there's a lot of ice melting that runs off our landscape instead of soaking in, instead of infiltrating. Stormwater is an issue because our landscapes are not totally clean, I guess you could say. They contain a lot of materials that this stormwater picks up. You can see some of these materials highlighted in the slide here. And of course, water flows downhill. So these materials end up in our waterways, which we depend on for drinking water, maybe first and foremost, but also for recreation. And of course, we have to think about wildlife too, depends on these water resources being clean. So stormwater has historically been an issue. We hear a lot about water quality and protecting drinking water these days, but in the past, historically, stormwater was managed with really one goal in mind: let's stop flooding. And the way engineers did it back in the day was they tried to move the water off the site as quickly as possible. This was called conveyance. Let's just get the water out of here. Some of you have probably been in communities where they have actually concreted their natural stream channels, sort of paved them with a hard surface to move that storm water as quick as possible. Well, that has some downsides, the biggest one being you're just sending that water downstream to the next community in line, and people have realized that, probably been a few lawsuits as well. And so over the last several decades, stormwater management has evolved to sort of a green approach, if you will. That old approach we call the gray approach. The new approach is the green approach, where we want to try to mimic nature's ability to manage stormwater, sort of like it did before we all came here and developed North America. And so rain gardens are an example of one of these green practices, and we'll talk about them a lot more in a second, but a little bit more about stormwater. In addition to flooding, stormwater can cause all the problems you see here below flooding on this slide. Erosion, it can add this soil into streams, which causes siltation. That can change the aquatic habitat. It costs more to treat water that has all this silt in it for drinking water. This has been documented in several studies across the country. It decreases groundwater recharge, and recharge, we can't get into it today, but it's critical for healthy streams. That issue with water quality and pollutants and many of these things are threats to human health. Flooding is still a big deal. It's the costliest type of natural disaster that hits Pennsylvania, and it's becoming more frequent. Our floods are becoming more flashy because of changes in our weather patterns, but also because we have less open space to let water soak in. So rain gardens are trying to reverse this trend. So rain gardens are what we can do. We can install rain gardens and other best management practices to help sort of reverse this trend to more flooding. Best management practices, physical devices, or changes in behavior that will control the volume, rate, and or quality of stormwater runoff. And we're going to come back to those 3 ways rain gardens help manage stormwater in just a little bit. But before we just focus on rain gardens, let's talk about some of the other practices that may also have a role at your school. Certainly around your home they do. But disconnecting your downspouts, if you're connected to the stormwater sewer system in your community, is one thing you can do. Rain barrels you may have heard of. We're going to talk about rain gardens, but repairing buffers, better pet waste management, scooping the poop, using pervious pavers, proper disposal of hazardous household items, at clean sweeps in your community. These are all ways we can protect water quality as well. But let's focus on reducing stormwater runoff using rain gardens. This slide shows a few rain gardens there. I'll let you decide what's a rain garden and what isn't. But in addition to rain gardens, we also show permeable pavers. We also show a larger rain barrel, sometimes called a cistern here, and then we also show some riparian buffers and a green roof. We're going to focus in on a rain garden. A rain garden is actually a recognized technical practice that professional builders, landscapers can use to meet state requirements to reduce stormwater. And they have manuals that have diagrams that look very similar to what we have on the screen right now, showing sort of a cross section of what you want to have in a rain garden. So a rain garden is a shallow basin, preferably with a flat and level base that allows the stormwater to spread out and soak in. So you take a source of runoff, and instead of allowing that to flow into a ditch and then wash into a local stream, you're capturing that water in this garden where it can soak in slowly. So you're slowing, well, hold off on that in a second. I won't give away my thunder here. So they capture, they filter, and they infiltrate. Every picture you see here, all 4 of these are rain gardens, and they kind of, I think in my mind, show how adaptable this practice is. There is no best shape for a rain garden. It's what works for your site. And just to really hammer home that point, the stormwater that flows into a rain garden soaks into the earth instead of running off. Now, we'll talk about sizing in a second. You may only have room for a small garden, and that may allow some stormwater to leave when it fills up. It will kind of top off, and then water will flow out. But you do capture that first flush of water, and that helps a whole lot. So here's my thunder that I referenced a second ago. Rain gardens are a triple win. I really love to say this. They reduce stormwater volume, so the amount of stormwater, by capturing it, they're reducing the volume that gets into our streams. They're slowing down the rate of stormwater runoff. So even if your garden doesn't capture all the storm water, it does capture that first flow, and that slows down water flowing into streams. And that extra time we give our streams before they receive the full brunt of a storm can be enough to prevent downstream flooding. So this slowing the rate is very important. And then they also remove pollutants. If there's any pollutants in that stormwater that flows into our garden, I guess I shouldn't say any pollutants, but rain gardens are very effective at removing nutrients. There's evidence they can remove some toxic materials as well. And anybody who's maintained a rain garden knows they're very good at capturing solid waste, trash. So a triple win, keep that in mind. So hopefully we've defined rain gardens. Let's talk a little bit about how you would go about doing one of these projects. You really need to determine what your plan is, and that's thinking about your goals, uh, coming up with a budget. These gardens don't have to be expensive, but they can cost some money, and that can vary quite a bit depending on the size of the garden and some of the constraints you might encounter when you get around to building it. Uh, there's a role here for designing the gardens. This is something you can involve students in. Uh, this involves learning a bit about botany, so learning what plants work best and then selecting those. Coming up with a sort of a sequence of construction, so developing a strategy of how you're going to get this thing in the ground. Uh, Planting the garden is a great fun activity usually, unless you're doing it on a cold, rainy day. And then working on maintenance, coming up with a maintenance plan. There are special considerations schools have that Jody and I have kind of learned the hard way as we've tried to help schools do these projects over the years. We've learned that it's very important to make sure your facilities personnel are involved up front when you start thinking about this. And not only are they sort of aware that you're doing it, but that they're supportive, that they have buy-in. Because if they don't support it, chances are it's going to be much harder to do maintenance, and you may come to school one day and find that your garden is gone. It's very important that you choose a location around the school grounds that isn't in line for, say, a expansion of the parking lot or a new sports field down the road. This has happened to me in the past where we put in a garden. It takes several years for these gardens to get going, and just when they're kind of peaking out, uh, they are filled in because they're in the way of some other project. And then another thing that I've noticed is many times uh, teachers are anxious to put a garden in sort of the area where runoff is worse. And those areas usually have a lot of concentrated flow, we call it, maybe right below a big storm sewer outlet. Unfortunately, rain gardens are not really designed, unless you spend quite a bit of money, to handle high velocity stormwater flows. So be wary of those sites that might be highly eroded, and also sites that don't drain. Ironically, one of the myths about rain gardens is that they're great for wet sites, but they're not really. Rain gardens should drain. They should actually drain in a day, 2 days at max after a storm. Uh, Sites that are wet frequently have poor drainage, and a rain garden probably isn't a good idea there unless you were to do extensive soil work. So let's focus a little bit on picking that best location out. The only way to really do this effectively is to look at the property in person, get out there, walk around, preferably after a storm. Learn how stormwater is moving across your campus to see where there may be places that are ideal for rain gardens. Ideal places are going to be near a source of stormwater runoff. They're going to be accessible, so they're not going to be on super steep slopes. It's harder to do a rain garden on a slope, and the steeper the slope is, the harder it gets. So flat areas are ideal. Uh, Anything over a 10% slope is going to get really challenging, and actually anything over 5 is very hard. So you're looking for pretty moderate slope areas. And once again, you want areas that drain well. And let's talk about a couple other locational things here. Before I do though, uh, if you do find wet areas, before you build your garden, those are probably areas to avoid. But once you put in a garden, and this slide shows a garden that's recently been put in, you can see that the edges of the garden, kind of where the green trees and shrubs are, that's a fairly dry area. So when you think about plants, Jody's going to talk about plants, this evidence of water ponding there is helpful. It tells you that your wet plants can go in the middle of the garden, your plants that like wet conditions. But along the edges, you would put your plants that can tolerate some water, but prefer to be a little bit drier. But if this were a site that had not been touched, it was your first walk out there after a rainstorm and you saw this wet spot in the middle, that would probably be an area to avoid for a rain garden. We talk about setback distances with gardens. It's important to remember these gardens are infiltrating water. So if you put them too close to a foundation, you could actually be putting water in your basement. 10 feet is a general rule, but people sometimes break that without issue. Sometimes people are outside of 10 feet and they might still have a basement water issue. If you have a wet basement, you probably want to be more than 10 feet. If you have a pretty dry basement, you might be able to be a little less than that. It probably helps to start small before you would go to a big garden like this one. But that setback is a good general rule. You also want to be some distance from any wells. You don't want to put water back into the drinking water you're using. You want to stay away from your septic systems, your drain fields, your septic drain fields, and also you want to stay away from trees and tree roots. It makes digging a lot harder. Full sun sites are best. It's much harder to get the plants going in shade. So just a summary, avoid poor drainage areas, shade, steep slopes, areas with trees, stay away from well and septic. Karst is areas that are prone to sinkholes. Rain gardens can increase the speed at which sinkholes form, so you want to stay away from those areas. And also, if you can, it's okay to be near sidewalks and roadways, but just have a plan for if your garden overflows, that overflow won't become an icing hazard over your sidewalk or your streets or a flooding hazard. So we're going to talk in a little bit, pay attention to your outlet. Oh, this picture up here, this is an example of someone putting in what they called a rain garden, but really isn't, because that site is just too steep. There's no basin there. It's not going to hold water. The water is going to run off onto the sidewalk. So it's a beautiful garden, but it's not a rain garden. Before you do any sort of digging project, make sure you call this free service. I think it's free for schools. It's free for homes. It's not free for businesses. But this service will come out and do a search for utility lines to make sure you don't cut any utility lines. What a disaster that would be, right? So very important to dial the 811. So the next thing is to begin to investigate your soil. You've decided to do a project, you've got buy-in from facilities, and you have a location. Now let's get to know your soil, because you may think there's good drainage there, but you want to go a little farther than that. One thing you can do is grab a handful of it and squeeze it. If it's totally dry, moisten it a little bit, but squeeze it and see how well it sticks together. If after squeezing it sort of falls apart, after you open back up your hand, that's good. That shows the soil's got a bit of sand in it. But if it looks like pottery clay, sticks together in a tight ball, then you've got a real clay soil. And then you may need to do an infiltration test or a perk test. I won't get into this, but if you go forward with one of these projects, you may want to call Jody or I, or we could explain more about how to do a good perk test so that you can gain more confidence that the site you picked is actually going to drain well. The problem with a site that drains poorly is your plants may all die, and worse than that, because it's going to hold on to water, it could be an area that is really great for mosquitoes to grow. So you want a site with good drainage. When it comes to sizing a garden, there are kind of two ways to look at this. Do you want a garden that's going to probably manage all the storm water that flows into it? Or do you not have that room, or do you not have that ambition, and maybe you just want to do a smaller garden? Either way is fine, but it helps to know how much storm water is flowing into your property. So the way to do that is to ideally go to a service like Google Maps, look at an aerial view of your site and look where all the drainage areas, usually for a school, it's going to be look for all the roof area that drains to the downspout that's going to feed into your garden. With a school, you could also be getting drainage from parking lots or from athletic fields. So whatever it is, measure that area out. You can use simple tools in Google Maps and measure length by width. You may have to break your area into smaller areas, but determine the square footage that's coming into your property. Now we give a long example here, and we can certainly make some of these slides available to you. I don't think I'm going to go through the math because I'm already running out of time here. But basically, you're going to come up with your square footage area. And guidance from one of our specialists at Penn State said that based on a 1-inch storm, which is a pretty good storm, this person was a he at Penn State. He estimated that if you're going down 6 inches for your garden, that every square foot of that garden could hold about 0.5 feet of rainwater. So an area of rain garden that had 52 cubic feet, divide that by 0.5, it tells you that you need 104 square foot garden. This method here tends to result in smaller sized gardens, I think more accurately sized gardens. But there are other tools you can use that I think are also handy. There's a calculator that an organization called NEMO, Non-Point Education for Municipal Officials. This is a great organization. They have a calculator. You can plug your numbers in and it'll give you an estimate. That will tend to be a little bit larger than what our Penn State formula does. And then this handy guide from Wisconsin is also helpful. So let's talk quickly about construction in my last few minutes here. You'll have to figure out a way to remove the surface grass. One of the easiest way to do this is to use a herbicide, but you can also do it manually. It helps to kind of paint out the outline of your garden. Any shape works. I encourage schools to really give a lot of thought to choosing a location and a design that fits in with the existing landscape so the garden doesn't look like an eyesore. If your soils don't drain well and that's your only site, you have to use it. You can think about amending the soils with sand and compost. That gets to be a lot more expensive and challenging. And Jody will talk about mulching when she talks about plants. If you don't have the labor force or the desire to do the digging by hand, you can have your school, if they have equipment, or hire someone to use a small excavator to do it. Notice how the excavator isn't operating in the future garden. They're staying outside of it to avoid compacting the soil. You want to keep that soil as loose as possible. And here's a picture of some excellent loose soils and some hand digging. I talked about you could do these on steep slopes, and here's proof of it. You do a lot more digging on the high end, and then you move that soil to the low end to form a little berm, and you can put a nice garden on a sloped site. But the steeper that slope is, the more you have to dig down the deep end to get that flat and level bottom. This is the rule everybody breaks with rain gardens, and I guess it's okay. Any rain garden is better than no rain garden, but your goal, especially for a school garden, you want to do it right, is you want that flat and level bottom. And remember, flat and level are two different things. You can have flat on a slope, but a rain garden should not only have a flat bottom, it should have a level bottom. With a flat and level bottom, you're spreading that stormwater out and you're maximizing infiltration. So here's somebody just sketching out the outline of their garden before they begin digging. I think they're using a hose either to sketch it out. Sometimes it helps to wet the soil before you dig. That'll soften it up. Inlets and outlets, it's very important to make sure you don't get a rush of stormwater into your garden that could cause erosion. So you notice the stone beds here or the concrete little blocks sticking out. They help reduce the flow of water, slow down its erosive potential. And then outlets are very important. Big gardens, professionally engineered gardens often have an overdrain inside the garden that allows water when the garden overflows to go into a storm drain system. You probably won't be doing that, although it's possible. That's sort of a more advanced, more engineering recall. What you're probably going to have to do is plan for a little break in your berm, a little low point in your garden that will allow water to flow out in a controlled fashion. And you want this outflow not to flow across sidewalks or roadways if you could help it. You want to direct it somewhere where it can infiltrate more and certainly not be a hazard in the winter by icing up. So this one flows into a yard. You can see the blue arrow there. This one flows into a storm drain. These flow off-site onto, in one case, a woodland, in another case, a yard. Berms aren't always necessary. A berm is a little embankment around the garden, but the nice thing about a berm is it's less digging you have to do. By building up your berm, you're gaining freeboard, right? So you don't have to dig as deep to get as much storage area. And just pictures of gardens here. Some of these are around institutions. A lot of them are homeowner gardens. Some have berms, some don't. A lot of different ways to do this. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some of you may not be liking some of these gardens, and I understand that. Others of you may love some of them, and hopefully that's the case. A lot of flexibility in design. All right, Jody, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, right on time too.
Okay, so hello, I'm Jody Sulpizio, an extension educator from York County. I'll just say that while I'm getting ready to share. Oh, it went back to the beginning. Hold on. So I get the fun part. I get to talk about plants. That's my favorite part of rain garden projects. Oops. I am, sorry about that. Choosing plants. Okay. So I'm in the right spot. So a rain garden, you know, is like any other garden. To be successful, you need to choose the right plants. And this is where you may feel that you need a little bit of help. And there are resources, which we'll show you later, that can help you with choosing plants. So you want to plan for your rain garden. You want to think about the conditions of the site and aesthetics also. So conditions of the site, you're going to consider light. Andy did mention that most rain gardens are best in full sun. But you can still plant if you have shady sites, but you just want to make sure you take that into account when you're picking plants. Soil texture, you also want to know a little bit about your soil, like Andy had mentioned, and then moisture. So we'll talk about the different zones of the rain garden. Aesthetics, consider plant height, color, texture. Think about, you know, native plants can get very tall. So you want to keep that in mind when you're choosing plants. The location of it. They can look a little bit messier if they're really tall. So you definitely want to look into that as you're picking the plants. So choosing the plants here, you want to give your garden beauty through all seasons. So there's just a variety of pictures right here, but definitely consider some early spring, summer blooms, and then even fall blooms. And you want to have plants available for wildlife during all different seasons also. Yeah, so I'm going to skip this slide here. But I just wanted to show, I keep saying native plants, and there are definite benefits to having native plants. You can see here, the turf grass is right there at the red arrow. You can see how short and tiny the roots are of turf grass, really do nothing for water quality. So you can see the roots of native plants, perennials and grasses, things like sedges. Those roots really grow down into the ground very, very deep and really help with infiltration in the rain garden. So there's a whole community underground that is very, very beneficial. So, you know, make sure you think about that as you're picking plants. You want those native plants with the very long roots. So the plants are going to intercept the water. They're going to help with infiltration. And also keep in mind during the summer, during the growing season, plants are also going to, there's going to be evapotranspiration too. Water's going to be evaporating from the soil. It's also going to be transpiring from the plants. So the water, you know, that the plants are taking up from the ground will transpire and be vapor going back into the atmosphere. So that also helps to reduce surface runoff in the growing season. So again, the plants with the deeper roots are going to absorb more water. In a typical garden, when you're using native plants, you don't have to fertilize, and you also do not need to use pesticides. They're very resistant to pests. It's pretty easy to maintain a rain garden after the first year. If you're using native plants, there's very minimal maintenance. And typically they're very drought resistant too, so you don't have to water after they're established. It is important to water though that first year, especially during the drought, if there is a drought, like there was this past fall. I did a rain garden and I spent a lot of time watering after we planted in September because we were very, very short on rain. The plants are going to help to prevent erosion. So you want to include plants in the garden that have that year-round function. So you want to consider all layers of the garden, and you want to have some plants that are low growing and even have some semi-evergreen leaves that are going to stay on the plants throughout the winter to help to prevent some of that erosion. You can see this site's not in the winter, but you can see the erosion, and this was after the garden was first planted. So you can still see water was entering the garden. It was actually coming from a parking lot. So here's just some examples of plants that are really important. When you're thinking of a garden, you need to consider all layers, like I mentioned. And it's really, really important to have some type of ground cover at that very base layer to prevent some of that erosion that was in that last picture. So two good ones, golden ragwort, Pacra is one that I use a lot in rain gardens because it spreads and it's very low growing, has pretty yellow flowers. And then sedges are good too. This is a creek sedge that is beneficial. And that ground cover also is going to help to suppress weeds. So less weeding on your part, and they also will help to filter sediment. So let's talk a little bit about the moisture zone. So Andy had mentioned some parts of the garden are very dry. Some parts are wet after a rainstorm. But when it's not raining and we're in a drought state, those plants are in pretty dry conditions. So you need to pick plants based on the zones. We have the wet moist zone, the moist dry zone, and the dry zone. So those plants that you put in the dry zone definitely have to be able to tolerate drought in very dry conditions. Those that you put in the wet zone, the very lowest part of the garden, they need to be able to survive being inundated underwater for some time, and not every plant can survive that. So we do have some resources to help you learn that too. I'll go over those in a minute. Also, well, this is just an example here. Consider adding things that aren't flowering so much, like the sedges, the rushes, and the grasses. They help to create root competition, really encourage plants to follow the normal growth patterns and not outgrow other species. So it's important to incorporate those. Diversity is important, not only adds beauty, but also really does create that thick root system to keep the garden in good shape. So choosing plants, I like to use plugs for my rain garden projects. So you can see they're about 1 inch by 1 inch in diameter, I guess, but they're then about 3 inches deep. You can get those from wholesale places. We've also had plug sales, like with our Master Watershed Steward program, and you can plant those about 1 foot apart, and they really fill in nicely. If you want to go the container route, you may be spending more money on those container plants. The plugs would be cheaper and you can plant really dense, but that would just be based on your budget and the availability of the plants that you can source. So where can you get these native plants? There are local sources. You can check out the Master Gardener plant sales, the Master Watershed Steward tree and plug sales, conservation districts, other conservation organizations, and some nurseries. Nurseries you have to watch. You might not be getting true native plants, so be careful there. Mail order is convenient. There may be a broad species of plants available, but you can't examine the quality. So just keep that in mind if you're mail ordering plants. Also, our friends at the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources have a great website showing you where you can buy native plants. So there's links there. So if you need help finding sources, that's something that we can help with. I know in York County, we put together a big list of places that you could find native plants. So choosing plants. So if you're using the plugs, like I said, plant dense, that's going to help to fill in quickly. Every 10 to 12 inches, 10 is a little bit better than 12, it will grow in very nicely. So we have some examples here. Well, I'll show that next slide. But this is an example of planting dense. The plants reseed, they knit together, and they hold the soil in. And this was the first year of growth in one of my projects. So here, the first picture shows after planting in a few weeks, and then one after 1 year. So you can see how much growth in 1 year. So if you do plant dense, it establishes pretty quickly. And then this would be after the plants become established. And again, you can see all different layers of the garden, and you have some grasses and sedges mixed in there with the perennials. So I am a big stickler on this. So we do a lot of rain garden projects. I coordinate the Master Watershed Steward program in my county, and sometimes fewer species is much easier. It's easier in the long run, especially for maintenance. So, you know, this example, it's 875 square feet garden space using about 11 to 12 species. If you start to get into like 20, 25 species, it gets very difficult to take care of. If you're doing this with school kids, fewer may be better. Just keep that in mind when you're selecting plants. Then I don't have a lot of time to go into too much detail with different plants, but I have some examples for each zone. So this is a wet moist zone, blue flag iris, swamp milkweed, cardinal flower. They're all good examples of those that can tolerate a lot of moisture. So for instance, like blue flag iris, this would be great for your kids to investigate these plants. You know, the leaves are a unique texture. They're kind of sword-like. The flowers are unique. They have kind of landing pads for insects. It's just one of my favorite flowers to use in a garden, and they form a thick horizontal rootstock, and they're also unpalatable to deer and other herbivores. So keep that in mind when you're selecting plants, how much deer are around or rabbits. Then swamp milkweed, definitely always a favorite because it is a pollinator plant, or it's a host plant for the monarch caterpillar. So they're going to feed on it. And then cardinal flower, just a bit different plant with long spikes, very showy flower, striking bloom. It blooms for a long time. So a unique one to put in a garden. With cardinal flower, though, it does not stay where you put it. It's going to hop around, and it may come up in a different place following years. Again, some examples from just the moist zone, so not as wet, couldn't withstand as much inundation as the wet moist zone plants. So we have great blue lobelia, bee balm, New England asters. Bee balm is a great plant to attract like hummingbirds, hummingbird moths, if you're familiar with them. It's a mint, so a great thing to show students. All mints have square stems. So there's all kinds of stuff you could incorporate with the plants with your students. So moist dry zone, wild geranium, blazing star, threadleaf blue star. I really like the blazing star, which is Liatris, because of that club shape. It's very linear, and it just adds some texture to your garden. You can see that picture. There's a lot of grasses used there, and that just really, that color pops. So it's a pretty cool plant. Threadleaf blue star blooms early in the spring, but then in the fall it turns this really orange color, and it's very bushy. So it's a really cool plant. Again, kind of feathery looking leaves. So nice texture in the garden. And then dry zone. So these plants can withstand very dry temperature or very dry conditions. So butterfly weed, very colorful with the orange flowers there, but that's a good one to put in. It self-seeds freely. It does die back and it does sprout from tubers. So I've not had well, I'll skip all that. I'm going into too much detail. Blue-eyed grass, very cool flower on the spiky leaves there, and purple coneflower, long bloom time. A lot of people are familiar with the coneflower. So that's just a little bit about selecting plants. Now, after you plant, you put all this time and effort and money sometimes into these gardens. So you want to protect your investment, right? So after planting, we say only mulch that first year. You want to cover that bare soil after you plant. But typically when those plants grow in, like that one slide of the final growing there, it doesn't really need mulch after that because the plants have taken over. Also, after planting, you want to leave the vegetation there. That is a seed source for, it's a seed source for the plants that are reseeding and growing the next year, but also for birds. And it's also habitat. It's going to provide cover for wildlife in the wintertime. So we recommend that you cut it back just in the spring. I'll talk about that in a minute. So after planting, water is needed, weeding, and then replacing plants that maybe have failed. So I have learned along the way here, you need to have a watering plan if you're planting a rain garden. It's not going to need watered likely after that first growing season, but for instance, we planted a rain garden mid-September this year, and then there was no rain for many, many weeks. So I had to figure out and find a way to get water to there pretty much like every other day. So I spent a lot of time. So really have a plan. How are you going to get that watered? If you're planting it, you need to do some of this maintenance to make sure it's successful. And then weeding can be challenging. It might be nice to like label your plants so you know where they are so you can identify weeds a bit more. And then as needed, you can replace plants that don't make it. So after year 2, cutting back the dead tops in the spring, I have, like when we work with municipalities, I have them cut the gardens back in the springtime. You can leave the tops there or you can remove them. That's kind of up to you. If you leave them, there may be a bit more reseeding. Again, replacing plants in year 2, and don't add that additional mulch. And if you have an under drain, so this is a picture of a rain garden. You see the white drain pipe there that actually was designed and engineered to have an under drain. So if you have to do something like this, you want to make sure that it's designed and built that you're able to clean that under drain out. So after planting, be flexible. Plants are going to rearrange themselves over time according to their needs. So that cardinal flower that you can see in the picture, it hops all around this garden, which is kind of fun, but it doesn't always stay as put. And some plants, like you can see the brown-eyed Susans here, they grow a lot at the beginning, but they may over time sort of phase out because they're more of a short-term perennial. So keep in mind that, like when we do meadow projects, they're really abundant at first, but then they start to disappear and other plants will come in. But that's just learning more about plants. So how can you involve students? So they could be take part in all parts of a rain garden, planning it, definitely planting. I had done a rain garden in the York City School District, and a lot of these kids had never planted a plant before. And it was just really rewarding to work with them. Performing maintenance, help them. They can help with weeding. They could set up some type of monitoring maybe what kind of insects or wildlife visit, monitor which plants are growing well, which are not. So there's all kinds of things that you could incorporate. A lot of times schools will work with partners like Extension or other community groups or environmental groups. So it gives them that experience to work with others. Kelly in this picture was from Audubon. So it was Extension, Audubon, and the school district. So it was great. We could go in and do education with the students and really formed a relationship there with that school. Educating others, they could develop some educational signage. They could have an event at school where the parents come and have some type of education, or they could educate other students at the school. So there's all kinds of opportunity for the students to be involved, I feel, in all parts of the rain garden, and then continuing to educate and learn from it. So Penn State has some resources that we wanted to share with you. We do have some activities like Rain to Drain and Watershed Decisions. We even have a book now that your students could read called it's called Brook Meets a Stream Doctor. So these are all things that you could do in the classroom that would relate to stormwater and why you would develop a rain garden or green your school. So these are all available on our website. And aligning this with your curriculum. Andy and I didn't take the time to align it exactly to the Steel standards because that's just a little bit more in depth than what we're doing here. But you could really incorporate rain gardens into science, of course, but literacy, environment and ecology. You could even align it with, or work when you're teaching about policy and local government. We do a lot of these projects with municipalities who have certain goals that they have to meet to reduce stormwater in their municipality. And rain gardens is just one of those best management practices that they can count for credit to remove sediment and nitrogen from their stormwater runoff. And then math. There's, sizing the rain garden, calculating the runoff that's coming off of the school roof. You could even do some type of research if you're counting things in the garden. There's all different ways to be creative and really work in all different subjects with the rain garden. So there are alternatives too. Andy mentioned some of these at the beginning. So if you can't do a rain garden, there's other ways to reduce stormwater on your property or on the school property. So you could put in downspout planters or downspout gardens, bioswales or vegetated swales, stormwater treatment trains, rain barrels. Even if you don't have a great site for a rain garden per se, any native garden is beneficial. Converting some of that turf grass to meadow if you don't have a spot for a rain garden, permeable pavement, vegetated buffer strips, and even just strategically placing trees and shrubs on the school campus that could help to reduce stormwater is definitely a benefit. And then maybe a green roof. Maybe you can't green roof your whole school, but maybe there's an athletic shed, like a shed for storing athletic stuff. And it would be kind of fun, even just putting a little green roof on the mailboxes is kind of fun for students. So there's different things you can do if you can't put in a rain garden. So all of these practices are very beneficial. They help to decrease property damage, improve health of both humans, wildlife, and improve the health of our waters. They provide very valuable wildlife habitat. And overall, if you implement these BMPs, you in the long run will save money, less mowing. There's not a lot of maintenance with rain gardens after they're established. So not much mowing. So you're not using resources like gasoline and the manpower to be on a lawnmower all day long. So we do have some resources. So there is on our website, you can find rain garden resources from Penn State Extension. And one thing that we're in the process of developing are these rain garden plant fact sheets. So we have a variety of plants of all the different zones in a rain garden. So we started with perennials. We have about 26 perennials on there, and we're starting with trees and shrubs now. So they show the site conditions, height, bloom color, bloom time, hardiness zone, salt tolerance is a big one, and spreading habit. So these are very helpful. We made them to help people like you who might be developing rain gardens but don't know a whole lot about plants. Some other extensions have some really good how-to manuals for rain gardens. So this is Wisconsin. Nebraska has a good one. There's a good one out of New Jersey, I think Rutgers. So we do highly recommend that you look at other extensions for other resources. And then just some other resources that extension has. We do have this homeowner's guide to stormwater, which really walks you through the steps that you need to successfully manage stormwater on your property. And then we developed this Stormwater Basics series to include videos and articles to help to answer very common questions from residents. So just as basic as what is stormwater? You know, what are stormwater pollutants? Maybe you've heard of an MS4, but you have no idea what that stands for. Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System is what an MS4 is. These are maybe something you could show your students too. Why use a rain barrel? What's allowed to go in a storm drain? So these are all quick, short videos to help teach these different topics about stormwater. And we also have this roadside guide to clean water to help you recognize best management practices in the community. For instance, what are cover crops? What's a native meadow? We have one on rain gardens, riparian buffers, another good resource for you. And then we also developed this watershed friendly certification, and we have upgraded it from just residents who could do this to larger campuses like schools or businesses or churches could take this certification and actually certify your school. And the objectives of this are to reduce stormwater from the school, reduce pollution, conserve water, and support wildlife and pollinators. So that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. If you do need more information, and Andy and I are here to take questions, but again, we have a lot of resources at extension.psu.edu. So I think we actually did it, Andy, and we have 7 minutes or so for questions.
Good job,
Hope
Jody.
you're
Yeah.
excited about rain gardens and maybe trying to do this with your school. Again, it might be daunting to try to do this yourself, but we are, and other educators or master watershed steward coordinators across the state might be able to assist or at least, you know, link you to the right resources. So we'll take questions. If you want to unmute, you can ask away.
You can drop your questions in the chat box too. That might be a little bit easier. Anything
I missed, Andy, that maybe you wanted to mention?
You know, I was just thinking of that, Jody, and I don't think so. I think between you and I, we covered it pretty well. Yeah, absolutely. If this if this sounds like something interesting to you, but you're still thinking of some barriers, feel free to share those with Jody and I. We may have encountered those barriers, and we may have some ideas for how you can overcome them on a school site.
I will say, working with the one that I did at the school, something that I learned was when we planted the rain garden, we hit a lot of fill from the building being
Yes.
constructed. And it was super, super difficult digging. And these are the kids who had never really planted anything before, but they had a great time. They loved it. They were hard workers, and we worked through the issue. And the native plants are meant to, or they're able to survive in pretty cruddy soil site conditions. And the garden did great. It was just initially getting them in the ground that was difficult. So I did learn dig before you do your planning, as in planning, not planting. just to make sure it is doable for the kids.
Yeah, we had a project. It wasn't a school. It was actually a retreat center for nuns, and their garden did not drain. And we learned a lesson about infiltration there. Uh, the top surface seemed fine, but the garden did not drain. So we had to go in there and dig like an extra foot down, loosen up the soil, and then the garden functioned real well. So I'm not sure what the message there is, but really pay attention to your soils. The other thing you said, Jody, that sparked a thought in my mind was those native plants. Yes, they do very good in most soils. People often are compelled to fertilize plants when they first put them in the ground, but you don't want to fertilize your native plant plugs. That would be sort of defeating the purpose of removing pollutants from stormwater. And your native plants will do just fine. And then the other thing, if your site is on the marginal end with infiltration, uh, native plants, I've observed anyway, curious on your thoughts, Jody, they'll gradually over several growing seasons improve the drainage in your garden. Those roots really do make a difference. You'll see better drainage, quicker drainage over years.
Right, because the roots are so extensive, right?
Yeah, they're probably removing that water via evapotranspiration, as Jody mentioned, maybe more than pumping it deeper into the aquifer. But whatever's going on there, a poor draining site can become a good draining site with the addition of native plants. Somebody asked in the chat if I'm related to Ed Yenshaw from Plymouth. I think I may be, but I'm not sure. There aren't too many of us Yenshaws out there. Someone said green infrastructure is being used in some Arizona cities. Yes, it's increasingly being used around the country and around the world. What's the price range for a regular garden? Boy, oh boy.
So I can answer this if
Yeah,
you'd
go ahead.
like. So I'll just give you an example. So a plug, I like to use the native plugs. They're about between $1 and $2 per plug. So let's say I just did like a 3,000 foot rain garden in September, maybe a little less than that. And I probably spent at least 4,000 on plants. And then, had to buy mulch for that size. So the whole project was for, we had funding of $5,000. So there are grants that you can get through all different organizations. Like Giant Foods actually has these small mini grants that you could possibly tap into, or maybe a water municipal water source like Pennsylvania American Water, Susquehanna River Basin Commission. So there are different places where you can get grants for projects like this. The one I just did was funded by a local Rotary Club, and they paid for the whole thing. So, and then, okay, so getting the land ready, that's what I missed. Okay, so, well, I think Andy talked about it, and actually is you need to think about how you're going to remove the sod or kill the sod, which could be an expense if you have to kill it or have somebody remove it. If you can hand dig it and remove it yourself, then it's free. Just think too, when you're doing that part of the project, that you have to have somewhere to put that grass that you dug off. So if you would rent like a sod remover, that could be an expense, but then you have all this sod that you have to do something with. So that could be an expense. The mulch, any tools that you might need, any kind of watering assistance that you might need. I bought like a water tote, so that was an expense.
I think the price for plants you mentioned, Jody, is probably a little on the low end. That's a great price. It'd be hard to find them below that, but we really recommend plugs instead of seeds. Seeds a lot less reliable in terms of
Seed
getting
is,
good growth.
and yeah, seed is hard to identify everything as it's coming up. If you do a seed mix, it's going to be difficult for maintenance and
Makes a lot more
weeding out.
challenging.
Right.
I was just going to add that the projects I've worked on with schools, a few with grade schools and others with colleges or institutions, usually they have some of the equipment on hand or know where they can get it. So when it comes to prepping the site, they've got a small digger or they know somebody who has one and they have the shovels. But if you have to, source all that up front, then the cost can get higher. But there are grants out there, as Jody mentioned. One more I'll throw in is contact your county conservation district. They may be looking for a project and they might be able to tap into some funds as well. Or your local watershed organizations may have dollars available for a good project like a rain garden at a school. Yeah, there's all kinds of plant sales out there, and if you plan ahead, you can buy them and then keep them alive on the side of the school until you're ready to dig. Anything
Well,
else? Any
thank
other
you all.
questions?
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
If you
Thank
all
you.
do some rain gardens, we'd love to hear about them, and we're always looking for pictures. So if you have any pictures, send them our way.
Yeah, someone said local foundations. We do a lot with our York County Community Foundations. You may have something like that. TU, Trout Unlimited.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. All right.
Thank-
Thank you.
Thank